The photograph had survived fire, flood, and more than a century of careful handling, yet it was the shadow that refused to age. Taken in 1890, the portrait shows a well-dressed family seated stiffly before a painted studio backdrop, faces calm, posture proper, eyes fixed with the solemn patience demanded by long exposure times. Nothing about it seems unusual at first glance. No blurred limbs. No warped faces. No tricks of early photography. It looks exactly as it should. Until your eyes drift behind them. There, pressed against the wall where no light source could possibly reach, is a shadow that does not belong to anyone in the room. It stretches too long, bends at an impossible angle, and narrows into a shape that suggests shoulders, a head, and something like fingers curled inward. The family casts their own faint silhouettes, all consistent, all logical. This one is not. It touches no feet. It connects to no body. It leans toward them as if listening. Historians dismissed it as a chemical flaw. Physicists blamed lens distortion. Digital analysts ran reconstruction after reconstruction, stripping the image down to grain and silver. Each time, the same conclusion emerged: the shadow obeys no known rule of light. It reacts as if it were cast by something standing closer to the camera than the family, yet nothing appears there. When the contrast is adjusted, the shadow grows darker instead of fading. When the image is mirrored, it does not reverse correctly. It behaves less like an absence of light and more like a presence. What unsettles experts most is not what the shadow looks like, but where it is positioned. Studio records recovered from the period show the exact layout of the room, the lamps, even the height of the ceiling. In that space, at that angle, the shadow should not exist at all. And yet it does, patient, deliberate, and perfectly framed, as though it knew the photograph was being taken, and wanted to be remembered. Key point number 1 centers on the moment when the shadow is first truly noticed and examined, transforming an ordinary historical photograph into a scientific and psychological anomaly. For decades, the 1890 portrait existed quietly in an archive, catalogued as a routine studio photograph from the late 19th century. It was handled by gloved hands, digitized for preservation, and occasionally reproduced in academic texts about early photography. No one lingered on it long enough to question what they were seeing, because the human mind tends to accept images that fit familiar patterns. A seated family, a painted backdrop, controlled lighting, and the stiff formality typical of the era all signal normality. The shadow only reveals itself when that sense of normality is interrupted. The first person to flag the anomaly was not a paranormal researcher or a conspiracy theorist, but a graduate student tasked with enhancing contrast levels for a digitization project. While adjusting exposure curves to bring out fabric details, they noticed a dark shape deepening behind the family rather than washing out as expected. At first, it appeared to be a stain or chemical irregularity, common in photographs of that age. Early photographic plates were notoriously unstable, and emulsion defects often left dark blooms or streaks. But this shadow had edges. Its outline sharpened as the image clarity increased, behaving unlike any known chemical artifact. Instead of dissolving into grain, it asserted form. When the anomaly was flagged for further review, a small team of imaging specialists examined the original plate under controlled lighting. They documented the shadow's boundaries, density, and relationship to surrounding elements. What became immediately troubling was its directional inconsistency. In the photograph, the visible shadows cast by the family members fell slightly to the right and downward, consistent with a main light source positioned above and to the left. The anomalous shadow, however, fell inward, toward the subjects, angling against the established direction of illumination. In physics, shadows are obedient. They align themselves with the logic of light. This one did not. Further analysis revealed something even more unsettling. The shadow did not diffuse at its edges as shadows normally do. Instead, its perimeter remained unnaturally crisp, as if the object casting it were closer to the photographic plate than the family itself. This contradicted the spatial logic of the image. There was nothing between the camera and the subjects that could produce such a silhouette. Studio records from the period listed no props, screens, or assistants positioned in that space. The room was small, enclosed, and meticulously documented. The shadow suggested a body where no body could have stood. Scientists attempted to recreate the conditions using replica equipment from the era. Period-accurate cameras, lamps, and chemical plates were employed to test every plausible explanation. Light leaks were simulated. Double exposures were tested. Plates were intentionally damaged to observe defect behavior. None produced a shadow that behaved remotely like the one in the photograph. When defects appeared, they spread irregularly or followed the chemistry of the emulsion. When shadows appeared, they aligned perfectly with the light source. The anomalous shape in the portrait refused both categories, existing in a space between error and intention. Digital reconstruction added another layer of disturbance. When the image was inverted, mirrored, or color-mapped, the shadow reacted differently than the rest of the photograph. Its density values remained stable while surrounding areas fluctuated. In some enhanced scans, faint internal variations appeared within the shadow itself, suggesting depth rather than flat darkness. It began to resemble not an absence of light, but an obstruction with volume. This contradicted every foundational principle of photography, which records light, not objects that emit none. The psychological impact of this discovery was subtle but profound. Researchers reported an odd reluctance to look at the image for extended periods. Eye-tracking studies conducted later showed that viewers' gazes lingered on the shadow longer than on any face in the portrait, even when instructed to focus elsewhere. The brain seemed unable to categorize what it was seeing, triggering a low-level cognitive stress response. People described a sensation of being watched, despite knowing intellectually that the photograph was inanimate. This reaction was not universal, but it was consistent enough to raise concerns about perceptual processing rather than superstition. Attempts to dismiss the shadow as pareidolia, the mind's tendency to see patterns where none exist, failed under scrutiny. Pareidolia dissolves when images are simplified or degraded. This shadow did the opposite. The more data extracted from the photograph, the more defined it became. It resisted abstraction. Even when reduced to basic luminance maps, its outline remained intact. It did not require imagination to exist. It imposed itself. What unsettled scientists most was the implication that the shadow was recorded intentionally by the camera, obeying the mechanics of exposure while defying the rules of illumination. A camera cannot invent shapes. It can only record what light allows it to see. If the shadow was present on the plate, something must have interfered with the light at the moment the shutter opened. Yet every attempt to identify that interference failed. There was no corresponding physical explanation, no missing object, no overlooked variable. The shadow stood as evidence of an interaction that could be measured, documented, and repeated in analysis, but never explained. This first turning point marks the shift from curiosity to unease, from historical oddity to scientific problem. Once the shadow was proven to be real, consistent, and immune to conventional explanation, the photograph ceased to be a passive artifact. It became a question without a framework, a recorded event that did not fit within existing models of reality, quietly suggesting that something had occupied that space for the fraction of a second it took to capture the image, something that left no trace except the darkness it displaced. Key point number 2 unfolds when investigators attempt to trace the origin of the shadow not through physics, but through history, uncovering a chain of human decisions and omissions that suggest the anomaly may be tied to intent rather than accident. After scientific replication failed to yield answers, archivists turned their attention to the people in the photograph and the circumstances surrounding its creation. The portrait was commissioned in late autumn of 1890 in a small studio that operated only briefly before closing under unexplained financial strain. At first, this detail seemed irrelevant, but as records were cross-referenced, it became clear that the studio's closure coincided closely with the date the photograph was taken, as though something about that final session had disrupted more than business. The family in the portrait was initially believed to be ordinary, their names preserved only in faint ledger ink. Census documents revealed them to be well established in their community, with no criminal record, no public scandal, and no documented tragedies that would explain later erasure. Yet when genealogists attempted to follow their lineage forward, the trail grew strangely thin. Birth records appeared, but marriages vanished. Death certificates were either missing or listed causes so vague they bordered on meaningless. Entire branches of the family tree seemed to collapse inward, as if deliberately pruned from public memory. This pattern drew attention to the eldest child in the photograph, a boy whose posture was rigid even by 19th-century standards. His gaze, slightly off-center, appeared fixed on something just beyond the camera. In early reproductions, this detail was dismissed as a quirk of exposure. But when the photograph was enhanced alongside contemporaneous images of the same family, a discrepancy emerged. In later portraits, the boy was absent. Not deceased, not relocated, simply unrecorded. School registries from the period listed a student matching his description for exactly 1 year, after which his name never appeared again. Local newspapers from the era offered few answers, but one short article stood out. It described a private domestic disturbance reported near the vicinity of the studio on the same week the photograph was taken. No names were published. No charges filed. The article ended abruptly, as though the story had been intentionally abandoned. When researchers examined police blotters from that period, they found pages missing, cleanly removed, not damaged by age. The gaps aligned precisely with the date of the studio session. As this human context deepened, investigators began to question whether the shadow was merely a physical anomaly or a visual residue of something unacknowledged. Oral histories collected from the region contained whispered references to a family who would not speak of the room and a child who was never counted again. These accounts were inconsistent, fragmented, and often recounted with visible discomfort. No one claimed direct knowledge. Instead, each story deferred responsibility to someone else, creating a chain of distance that made verification impossible while preserving a sense of collective unease. The studio itself became the next focus. Architectural surveys revealed that it had been constructed over a repurposed structure whose original function was never officially recorded. Property deeds listed multiple ownership transfers in unusually short succession, often at prices far below market value. One early deed included a handwritten amendment, later crossed out, referencing an incident requiring permanent alteration of space. No further explanation was provided. When ground-penetrating surveys were conducted decades later, they revealed irregularities beneath the studio floor that could not be conclusively identified due to restrictions on excavation. What elevated concern to alarm was the discovery of correspondence between the photographer and an unnamed associate. In one letter, the photographer described a reluctance to accept a particular commission, citing a sense that something waits where the light should fall. In another, written after the session, the tone shifted to panic. He wrote of shadows behaving incorrectly, of reflections that lagged behind movement, and of a presence that seemed aware of being observed. The final letter ended mid-sentence. There were no records of the photographer working again. His equipment was sold off quietly, and his personal effects were never recovered. These findings reframed the shadow as potentially intentional, not in the sense of artistic manipulation, but as a consequence of human action or inaction. The possibility emerged that something had occurred during the session that the photograph recorded indirectly, a moment that participants either could not or would not acknowledge. This raised ethical questions about the nature of documentation itself. Photography was believed to be objective, a mechanical witness incapable of bias. Yet here was evidence suggesting that the camera had captured more than its operators intended, preserving a truth that those present sought to suppress. Psychologists consulted on the case noted that collective silence often forms around events that threaten social cohesion. When a community chooses not to remember, it does not erase the event, it merely relocates it into indirect expressions, rumors, omissions, and symbols. The shadow, in this interpretation, functioned as such a symbol, a visual remainder of something expelled from narrative memory but not from reality. Its persistence across reproductions and analyses mirrored the persistence of unresolved trauma within a closed system. As historical context accumulated, the shadow ceased to be an isolated phenomenon. It became entangled with patterns of disappearance, erasure, and avoidance that suggested deliberate forgetting. The photograph stood at the center of this web, a single frame in which light, people, and silence converged. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that understanding the shadow required acknowledging what the record did not say, and confronting the possibility that the image had preserved not just a moment in time, but the outline of a choice made by those who stood before the camera and those who later ensured that whatever had cast that darkness would remain unnamed. Key point number 3 emerges when controlled observation begins to reveal that the shadow is not a static artifact, bound to the past, but a responsive phenomenon that reacts to attention in ways that challenge the boundary between image and observer. After historical investigation deepened suspicion that the anomaly was tied to deliberate erasure, researchers attempted a final round of tests meant to close the case. The photograph was placed in a monitored environment, scanned repeatedly at fixed intervals, and subjected to routine archival handling procedures. Nothing was expected to change. Photographs do not evolve. They degrade, they fade, they fracture chemically, but they do not respond. The first irregularity was dismissed as equipment error. During a scheduled rescan, technicians noticed a slight shift in density along the inner edge of the shadow, a change so subtle it could easily be attributed to calibration drift. Yet when the previous scan was overlaid with the new one, the variance aligned too precisely along the shadow's contour to be random. The rest of the image remained perfectly consistent. Only the shadow showed deviation. When the scanner was recalibrated and the process repeated, the variation persisted, always localized, always inward, as though the darkness were compressing. This prompted a series of blind tests. Multiple technicians scanned the photograph independently, unaware of prior results. Each scan produced the same anomaly, but not identically. The changes were minute, measurable only in fractional luminance shifts, yet their pattern suggested directionality. The shadow appeared to thicken along the side closest to the family's faces, subtly encroaching into negative space that had previously been clear. No chemical explanation accounted for selective darkening that respected a non-physical boundary. When the image was displayed in a secure viewing room for extended observation, a new pattern emerged. Individuals reported an increasing difficulty looking away from the shadow once their attention settled on it. This was not described as fear, but as a kind of gravitational pull, an insistence that resisted conscious redirection. Eye tracking confirmed that viewers returned their gaze to the shadow even after being instructed to focus elsewhere. The phenomenon intensified over time, suggesting not a momentary perceptual trick, but a feedback loop between attention and perception. To rule out suggestion, researchers introduced control images with artificial anomalies. These produce no comparable response. Only the original photograph elicited fixation and discomfort, and only when viewers were allowed enough time for the shadow to register fully. Those who glanced briefly reported nothing unusual. Those who lingered described a sensation of presence, as though the space behind the family were occupied by something that did not wish to be ignored. Several viewers independently noted that the shadow seemed closer than the subjects, despite occupying background space, a spatial contradiction that the brain struggled to reconcile. The most troubling development occurred during a low-light examination intended to minimize visual interference. When ambient illumination was reduced and the photograph was viewed under narrow-spectrum light, observers reported the impression that the shadow deepened while the rest of the image flattened. Instruments confirmed that reflectance values across the photograph remained constant, yet subjective reports were consistent. The shadow felt heavier, more dimensional, as though it were exerting pressure on perception rather than merely absorbing light. One researcher, attempting to articulate this sensation, described it as the difference between looking at a picture of a door and standing before a closed door knowing someone is on the other side. The image had not changed in any overt way, yet its meaning had shifted from representation to threshold. This analogy was echoed by others who struggled to explain why the photograph now felt less like an object and more like an interface. When access to the photograph was temporarily restricted due to concerns about observer stress, an unexpected issue arose. Technicians tasked with cataloging related materials reported disturbances in adjacent storage areas. Motion sensors activated without detectable movement. Temperature fluctuations occurred in localized zones near the storage cabinet. These events were minor, easily dismissed individually, but their timing coincided precisely with periods of heightened analysis. When the photograph was returned to controlled viewing conditions, the disturbances ceased. At this stage, skepticism began to fracture. Not because the evidence proved anything extraordinary, but because the pattern of interaction defied passive explanation. The shadow behaved less like a flaw and more like a variable, its behavior contingent on observation, proximity, and duration. This raised uncomfortable parallels to observer effects in physics, though no mechanism existed by which a 19th-century photograph could participate in such dynamics. Further analysis revealed that the shadow's outline contained microvariations that shifted depending on resolution. At lower resolutions, it appeared vaguely humanoid. At higher resolutions, the form dissolved into complex gradients that resisted interpretation. It was never fully one thing or another. This instability prevented definitive classification, yet preserved the impression of intention. The shadow did not reveal itself fully, nor did it retreat. It maintained ambiguity with precision. The psychological toll on researchers became increasingly apparent. Sleep disturbances, recurring dreams involving darkened rooms, and heightened irritability were reported at rates exceeding baseline stress expectations. Importantly, these effects diminished when individuals were reassigned away from the project. No similar symptoms were reported among staff handling unrelated archival materials. The correlation was strong enough to prompt ethical review, though no formal cause could be identified. As observation continued, one final detail emerged that reframed everything that had come before. When the photograph was positioned alongside others from the same period and viewed peripherally, the shadow appeared to intrude into neighboring images, not visually, but perceptually. Viewers reported momentary impressions of darkness in images where none existed, as though the mind, once attuned to the anomaly, began to anticipate it elsewhere. The shadow had begun to propagate not through space, but through expectation. At this point, investigators were forced to confront a disturbing possibility. The shadow did not exist solely within the photograph. It existed within the act of looking. The image functioned as a catalyst, a fixed point that activated a response rather than containing a phenomenon. Whatever had been captured in 1890 was not confined to silver and paper. It had been recorded in such a way that engagement with it recreated the conditions of its presence again and again, each time someone chose to truly see it. Key point number 4 develops when containment efforts replace investigation, marking the moment authorities and institutions begin to treat the photograph not as an object of study but as a potential hazard. After reports of perceptual intrusion and psychological effects accumulated, oversight committees concluded that continued open access posed an unacceptable risk, even if that risk could not be formally defined. The decision was framed as precautionary, yet the language used in internal memos suggested something closer to fear than prudence. The photograph was reclassified, removed from public catalogues, and transferred to a restricted storage facility designed to limit both physical exposure and visual contact. The containment protocol was unusual in its specificity. Viewing time was capped. Personnel rotation was enforced. No individual was permitted to observe the photograph alone. Even digital access was curtailed, with compressed reference images replacing high-resolution files. These measures mirrored those used for fragile artifacts, yet the artifact itself showed no signs of deterioration. The concern was not preservation of the image, but protection from it. This inversion unsettled staff, who were accustomed to safeguarding objects, not guarding themselves against them. Despite these restrictions, incidents continued. Security footage revealed staff pausing outside the storage room longer than necessary, sometimes standing motionless before resuming their tasks. Interviews conducted afterward showed that most could not explain the delay. They described a sensation of needing to remember something important, though no specific memory surfaced. This compulsion faded once they left the area, leaving behind only mild confusion and unease. Over time, these pauses became frequent enough to be statistically significant. The most alarming event occurred during a scheduled relocation of the archive wing. The photograph, sealed within multiple layers of protective casing, was moved alongside other materials under strict supervision. During transit, one handler reported the impression that the crate felt heavier than its documented weight. Instrument readings showed no anomaly. Yet when the crate was set down, stress fractures appeared in the floor beneath it, inconsistent with the load distribution. Engineers attributed the damage to pre-existing weaknesses, but their reports noted the timing as highly irregular. After relocation, the restricted storage area exhibited environmental inconsistencies that resisted calibration. Humidity levels fluctuated without corresponding changes in the building system. Temperature sensors recorded localized drops near the photograph's housing, though adjacent areas remained stable. These readings were intermittent, never persisting long enough to trigger automatic alerts, but frequent enough to undermine confidence in the facility's controls. Technicians replaced sensors, rerouted ducts, and ran diagnostics, yet the irregularities followed the photograph, not the room. At this stage, institutional language shifted further. References to the shadow gave way to euphemisms: the artifact, the anomaly, the subject. Direct description was discouraged, ostensibly to prevent bias, but also to limit fixation. Training documents advised staff to avoid prolonged thought about the image outside of scheduled duties. The implication was clear. Attention itself was being treated as a vector, something that could carry effects beyond the moment of observation. This shift had unintended consequences. Rumors circulated quietly among staff, filling the vacuum left by official restraint. Some speculated that the shadow represented a form of recorded absence, a void impressed onto the photograph by an event too extreme to register directly. Others suggested the image functioned as a mirror rather than a window, reflecting something latent in the observer. None of these ideas were endorsed, yet none were fully dismissed. The lack of explanation made every hypothesis feel equally plausible and equally dangerous. External pressure mounted when word of the reclassification leaked. Journalists requested access. Academics challenged the restrictions, arguing that suppression undermined scientific integrity. In response, administrators released carefully worded statements emphasizing ongoing review while avoiding any mention of psychological or environmental effects. The photograph's existence was acknowledged, its nature minimized. This partial disclosure only intensified curiosity, drawing more attention to the very thing containment sought to obscure. In private, decision-makers confronted a paradox. The photograph seemed to exert influence when observed, yet restricting observation increased its symbolic power. The less it was seen, the more it was imagined. This dynamic mirrored historical patterns of forbidden artifacts, where secrecy amplified myth. Some argued for controlled transparency, believing that demystification would weaken the effect. Others warned that widespread exposure could normalize the phenomenon, allowing it to propagate unnoticed. A compromise was attempted. A heavily degraded version of the image was prepared for limited release, stripped of fine detail and reduced to low contrast. Analysts hoped that by removing the shadow's defining features, they could satisfy public interest without activating deeper effects. The release proceeded quietly, embedded within a broader collection of archival materials. Initial response was muted. Most viewers noticed nothing unusual. For a moment, it seemed the strategy had succeeded. Then reports began to surface from unrelated contexts. An art conservator described seeing a similar shadow while restoring an unrelated photograph. A medical imaging technician mentioned an unexplained dark region appearing consistently at the edge of scans, always dismissed as noise. Individually, these accounts meant little. Collectively, they suggested pattern recognition at work, as though exposure to the concept of the shadow primed observers to perceive it elsewhere. The phenomenon appeared to be decoupling from the original image, manifesting as expectation rather than replication. This development forced a reassessment of containment itself. If the shadow could not be isolated to a single artifact, then physical restriction was insufficient. The focus shifted to narrative control, limiting how the phenomenon was discussed, framed, and contextualized. Language guidelines were issued, advising against metaphorical descriptions that implied agency or intent. The goal was to anchor the anomaly within technical discourse, reducing its capacity to evoke emotional or imaginative responses. Yet even as these measures were implemented, internal documents reflected growing doubt. Analysts noted that every attempt to neutralize the shadow's impact relied on the assumption that it was passive. The evidence increasingly suggested otherwise. The shadow did not behave like a contaminant to be sealed or a puzzle to be solved. It behaved like a condition, one that emerged under specific circumstances and receded when those circumstances changed. Containment could manage exposure, but it could not undo the fact that the photograph had already been seen, studied, and remembered. As the institution tightened controls, a final observation unsettled even the most cautious voices. When the photograph was left unobserved for extended periods, environmental irregularities diminished. When scheduled reviews resumed, they returned. The pattern was consistent across locations and personnel. It was not the presence of the photograph that mattered, but the act of engaging with it. The shadow required no physical interaction, no direct contact. It responded to recognition alone, as though being acknowledged completed a circuit that had been waiting since the moment the shutter closed in 1890. Key point number 5 resolves not through explanation, but through acceptance of limitation, as investigators come to understand that the shadow cannot be separated from human perception and therefore cannot be eliminated, only accommodated. After years of containment, reframing, and narrative control, a final review panel was convened to determine whether the photograph should be permanently sealed, destroyed, or quietly returned to obscurity. The discussion revealed a shift that had been occurring gradually but unmistakably. No one spoke anymore about solving the anomaly. The language had changed from analysis to coexistence. What forced this shift was a series of longitudinal observations that reframed the shadow's behavior. Individuals who had been exposed to the photograph early in the investigation showed subtle but persistent changes in perception over time. These were not pathological. There were no hallucinations, no breaks from reality. Instead, there was an increased sensitivity to absence, to gaps in visual information, to spaces where something should be but was not. Subjects described noticing shadows in rooms before identifying their sources, or feeling unsettled by reflections that did not immediately resolve. The effect was not intrusive enough to impair function, yet distinct enough to be measurable. Crucially, these changes did not intensify indefinitely. They stabilized. This suggested that whatever the shadow initiated, it did not seek escalation. It was not predatory. It did not consume attention endlessly. Once the observer adapted, the influence receded into the background of awareness, like a learned perception that no longer required effort. This finding challenged earlier assumptions that exposure was inherently dangerous. Instead, it suggested that resistance, suppression, and fear amplified the effect, while acknowledgement diminished it. One researcher proposed a controversial interpretation. The shadow was not an entity or a message, but a record of a perceptual contradiction captured at the moment of exposure in 1890. Something had occurred that the human mind could not reconcile, and the camera, indifferent to meaning, recorded the unresolved remainder. The photograph did not contain an answer. It contained a question that could not be closed. Each observer who engaged with it reopened that question within themselves, not as content, but as process. This interpretation reframed the entire phenomenon. The shadow was not doing anything. It was being completed by the observer. This explained why containment failed, why replication was impossible, and why the effect spread through expectation rather than transmission. It also explained why the shadow never fully resolved into form. It remained suggestive, ambiguous, unfinished. It could not become concrete without collapsing the contradiction it embodied. Under this model, the photograph functioned as a kind of perceptual mirror, reflecting the limits of interpretation back onto the viewer. The discomfort arose not from what was seen, but from what could not be categorized. Human cognition depends on closure. The shadow denied closure while remaining undeniably present. It forced the observer to hold two incompatible truths simultaneously, that nothing was there, and that something had been recorded. Once this framework was accepted, the urgency dissolved. The photograph no longer needed to be destroyed because destruction would not erase the perceptual capacity it revealed. It no longer needed to be hidden because secrecy intensified projection. Instead, a new protocol was proposed, one rooted in informed exposure. The image would be contextualized, not sensationalized. Viewers would be prepared for ambiguity rather than promised revelation. The goal was not to neutralize the shadow, but to remove the expectation that it could be resolved. When this approach was tested in limited academic settings, the results were striking. Participants who were told explicitly that the photograph contained no answer, no hidden figure, no explanation waiting to be uncovered, reported significantly less distress. They still noticed the shadow. They still found it unsettling. But the sensation no longer lingered. Without the compulsion to understand, the perceptual loop failed to close, and the effect dissipated naturally. This led to the final decision. The photograph would remain archived, accessible under controlled conditions, accompanied by documentation not of conclusions, but of uncertainty. The official record would state plainly that the shadow could not be explained within current models of physics or psychology, and that attempts to force explanation had produced more disruption than insight. This was not framed as failure, but as boundary recognition. In the years that followed, interest in the photograph waned. It appeared occasionally in academic discourse as a case study in perception, ambiguity, and observer effect, stripped of myth but not of unease. Those who encountered it under the new framework reported a quieter reaction. The shadow remained strange, but it no longer felt invasive. It occupied its space in the image and nowhere else. Yet one final observation persisted, noted quietly and without commentary in the last internal memo addressing the case. When the photograph was reviewed after long periods of disuse, the shadow appeared unchanged. It had not grown. It had not faded. It had not evolved. It waited in exactly the same configuration it had held since 1890, neither advancing nor retreating. The only variable that had ever altered its effect was the mind that met it. In this sense, the shadow was not a threat or a mystery to be solved, but a boundary marker, a reminder that not everything recorded is meant to be understood, and that some images endure not because they reveal something hidden in the world, but because they expose the edge of what the human mind can hold before it reaches for meaning and finds only darkness where light should fall.